It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I want to thank Richard and everyone for inviting me. You know, I had the privilege and the great pleasure of knowing Peter Drucker, and in fact having an opportunity to work with him. And one of my happiest memories is walking into a reception one day, a large group of people, and seeing this very dapperly dressed, wonderful man across the room going, "Hi, Tammy." And it was Peter, and I remember that feeling and the joy it gave me then whenever I think of him and the lessons. Now, one of the experiences that I had with him, he used to speak quite often on panels and in programs that the company I was with ran. And one of his requests was that somebody would sit up on the stage with him in case someone from the audience asked a question that was difficult to hear. And I was always happy to do that. The first time I did it, and Laurent, I'll say this partly for you, the first time I did it, I thought, well, I must have some role other than just waiting for a question. So as we got near the end of the time, I began to make what I thought were very subtle little hand signals to Peter that it was time to wrap up his remarks. He stopped in the middle of his sentence and said, "Young lady, you stop that. I know exactly what time it is." So I'll try not to need that.
I won't stop you.
Okay. Well, my remarks today are titled 10 Assumptions That Are No Longer True. And I got interested in this topic because I found myself talking with many executives who didn't really know why they were doing something. The question of why do we do it the way we do it, I find today increasingly comes down to, I don't know. It's the way we've always done it. And in fact, as you roll back the layers, what you find is a set of assumptions that are no longer true. I want to share 10 of those with you today, but before I do, I want to take just a second on the context. Now, tomorrow, if you're able to join us, I'm going to speak for a few moments about what I would consider the context for this, and that is the link between capitalism and our organizations today. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to hear Roger Martin's wonderful talk this morning. I love his work, and I loved the talk that he gave. But with great respect, I'd like to say he's wrong.
You can ask questions afterwards if you want.
In at least one regard, and that is in putting customer and shareholder as the two ends of a spectrum. I personally think that that's a concept which is a bit confusing, and frankly, to people who've been leading over the past 20 or even 50 years, perhaps even a bit insulting. I think that Peter Drucker's views that customers are what a business is about is something that we've always believed. And it is something that managers have strove for over decades past. The problem is that the way we got there, the resources that we needed to energize in order to get there, were different in the past than they are today. And that leads to my first assumption. What do you need to do to be successful? I think that needs to be rethought. The old assumption was that to be successful, you had to manage capital well. You had to access it, you had to conserve it, you had to keep your costs low and get as much revenue as possible. It was a financially driven set of assumptions of how, in fact, you would serve your customer well. The companies that did it became icons. They figured out how to do mass production, how to organize themselves in hierarchical ways and standardize processes. And they became the companies that we'll all remember as the standouts of the past century. But I would argue that that assumption isn't true anymore. Capital is not the scarce resource, and managing it well is not going to drive you to be the iconic company of tomorrow. Today's scarce resource is idea. It's intellectual capital. I like to call it intelligence. Today's scarce resource is our ability to mobilize the intelligence of people around us, to tap into social media perhaps, to find ways to combine two ideas to come up with something new. That's what we should be holding up together. This pursuit of shareholder value and the pursuit of return on ideas. Those are the two that compare, and that's the big change that's occurring today. In each case, as I talk about these assumptions, I'm just going to rattle off a few ideas that I think you should take on, and I'll do it without great explanation, so catch me later if you want more. Here's what I think you should do with regard to this assumption. First of all, you should change your strategic metrics. Stop investing in projects based on net present value and internal rate of return. Start thinking about your investments in terms of maximizing the power of the idea. Second, you need to redesign your organizations. Move away from hierarchical organizations designed for consistency and standardization, and develop organizations that are optimized around the flow of ideas, that have strong horizontal challenges. And third, you need to change your staffing plans. Instead of hiring people with deep specialization, you need to hire people who have some breadth, who have the capability of understanding how their areas of expertise can contribute to the whole. That's the first. The second thing you should need to rethink are your operations. And the underlying reason there is that your operations today are based on an old assumption about what it costs to communicate. John has just given us some great examples that show how wrong those assumptions are, even in the last decade. The cost of communication has changed dramatically. And what it basically means is you should be substituting what I like to call coordination for planning and scheduling in almost every process in your organization. You should be looking for ways in the moment to find out where things are, where people are, and create the coordination rather than investing in the long-term planning. Redesign your processes starting today. The opportunity is at least as great, if not greater, than re-engineering was in the 1980s. Third, rethink the role of a leader. You know, if you look in the dictionary, it says that a leader is someone who's out in front, who has the answers. I don't think that's a reasonable assumption today. Leaders can't be out in front, and they certainly can't have all the answers. They don't even have access to the best information in many cases. A leader today needs to be someone who knows how to work with adults, treat people like adults, and create a context in which those adults are going to do their best work. So, select leaders by getting input from the people who will be led. We heard earlier about an employee-owned company. Adopt those practices in your own and get input about who would be the best person to create the context in the group you want to lead. And make sure those leaders spend their time soliciting ideas from others. Fourth, talent availability. Now, this was one of Peter Drucker's big themes, of course. He argued that when historians look back on the past century, even with computers and people in space and all of those kinds of things, that historians will say the biggest event of the 20th century was demography. It was lower birth rates and higher life expectancies, because those two things have fundamentally changed the shape of our populations. We no longer, in most countries, have pyramids, a few older people and a lot of kids. Most of us already today are at least diamonds, pretty narrow at the bottom. There aren't that many kids. And at some point, we'll probably actually be an inverted pyramid in the other direction. Now, the problem with that is Most of your talent management practices in your companies are predicated on the assumption of a pyramid. Here's what you need to do. Eliminate mandatory retirement, if you still have it, right away. Make your workplace conducive to older workers, including invest in development of older workers, train them, and create career paths that give them the flexibility to work in the ways that they would like to. Get prepared to fight for a disproportionate share of talent if you have to hire young people, because they're going to be scarce resources. And maybe most importantly, rethink career paths, moving away from the idea that promotion can always be the answer for everyone who wants more money and more opportunity. Fifth thing to rethink, do you need employees? The old assumption was we had them. That's what businesses were. That won't be true going forward. Contingent workers and a whole variety of alternative arrangements will be the ones that we'll see most common. You need to define your organization around the ideas and the customers those ideas are serving, not by the relationship of the people that are part of it. So right away, shift the metrics you use to judge your HR department. Stop measuring retention. Why do you care that they've held on to some mediocre person for 20 years who was never particularly well qualified for any of the job in any of those 20 years? That's not relevant. Instead, create a metric that measures the fit between a person's capabilities and the job they're being asked to do. Ask yourself what percentage of your organization is well qualified for the jobs you're asking for. And one of Peter Drucker's recommendations under this heading is charge your HR department with managing a broad set of talent, much like a film talent agency would, so that they're responsible for having part-time and contingent and contract and employees and can assemble the right team for you at the right time. 6, don't ever think everybody wants the same thing. The idea that all employees want the same thing, everybody will be turned on by money or security, is not a valid assumption. Assumptions vary by generation and by geography, and by other factors as well. My big recommendation here is don't fall in the trap that I hear so often of we need to create global consistency in our talent management practices. I think that's one of the most harmful phrases around today. You need individual customization. 7, rethink the contract that you have between employees, workers, and your organization. You know, the old contract used to be, I'll be loyal, and the company will provide me long-term protection and care. That assumption's gone. No companies can provide long-term protection and care in every case, but we haven't really acknowledged it. It's time to get rid of that assumption and be honest about what companies in fact can provide. Here's what you need to do. Remove all tenure-based practices. Retirement benefits, vacation benefits, promotion, none of that should be based on tenure. It should all be based on capability or qualification. Ensure that your management messaging is credible. Stop saying we're not going to lay any more people off, if in fact we all know that's not a reality. And work to establish a new equation that people honestly can trust. Figure out what your company can do and make that clear. 8, rethink the role of a career. Most of us grew up at a time when people had one major job. That was our career. That's not going to be true today. Most of the middle-aged people I've interviewed as part of my research on the generations already have 2 jobs. They're working for a company and they're doing something on the side. So assume that more and more of your employees are being distracted, if you will, pulled away from your organization by other exciting things they're pursuing outside work, and fight for that attention. 9, rethink how you measure performance. We've gotten used to measuring performance around an individual. Are they a superstar? Do they have potential? I think those things are wrong for today. We need to ask, has the person contributed to the task we wanted to achieve? We need to make performance management timed with tasks. We need to institute peer feedback because managers have a difficult time telling who actually contributed. And we need to tie compensation to team-based performance under those conditions of team-based input. And finally, my 10th is we need to rethink reliance on money. Most of us have grown up thinking that, well, if I pay them enough, they'll take on this crummy job, or move to places that I want them to move, or work harder even. There's so much research on that today. We know that particularly with knowledge-based work, it's simply not true. The code word for today is meaning. Meaning is the new money. And so the last thing I would recommend to you is very similar to what Kathy Mazzarelli said about her work at Graybar. Figure out what is unique about your organization. She clearly has. And find ways to make the uniqueness of your organization come through so that you attract people who are predisposed to love what it's going to be like working with you, who love the meaning of being part of your organization. Those are the assumptions and some of my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.